642 million people voted in India's 2024 elections. That is a larger turnout than the entire population of Europe. It requires a logistical operation unmatched anywhere else on Earth. Yet, in that exact same year, international researchers wrote India into a completely different category. They classified it as an electoral autocracy, a country that successfully holds competitive elections, but where the democratic space surrounding those elections is actively shrinking. Freedom House downgraded the nation to partly free, with a score of 66 out of 100. This chart shows the specific metrics researchers at the VDem Institute use to evaluate a democracy's health. While the election axis remains relatively stable, the axes measuring press freedom, judicial independence, and civil liberties show a steep decline, particularly over the last decade. The Indian government rejects these indices outright. Officials argue the methodology relies on Western liberal assumptions that fail to capture a civilizational democracy. They point to the reality of the 2024 results, where the ruling party actually lost its outright majority and was forced to govern in coalition. Both realities are confirmed by the data. The paradox of modern India is that the physical act of voting remains monumental, while the institutional freedoms required to hold power accountable between elections are demonstrably tightening. Look closely at how the elections themselves are regulated. In 2023, Parliament passed a new law altering the selection process for India's Election Commission, the body meant to referee the polls impartially. The legislation effectively gave the Prime Minister a disproportionate say over who leads it. This chart shows the disproportionate use of state machinery. According to a widely cited analysis of the Enforcement Directorate, out of 121 opposition leaders investigated by the agency since 2014, 115 belonged to rival political parties. When a few of those targets later defected to the ruling party, their cases were largely dropped. The watchdogs also measure media independence. Over the past decade, media ownership has heavily concentrated into politically friendly hands, punctuated by the 2022 acquisition of NDTV, which was widely seen as India's last major independent English news network. Today, Reporters Without Borders places India 161st out of roughly 180 countries for press freedom. Then there is a cross-party habit researchers call resort politics. To prevent lawmakers from being persuaded to defect before a confidence vote, party leaders regularly herd their own politicians onto planes and sequester them in luxury hotels, held completely incommunicado. In March 2025 alone, 38 opposition municipal politicians in Andhra Pradesh were moved out of state this way. The physical machinery to count votes functions reliably. The institutional guardrails designed to keep the system balanced have been systematically weakened. India is one of the fastest-growing large economies on Earth, but macroeconomic growth has not resolved acute poverty. On the 2025 Global Hunger Index, India ranks 102nd of 123 countries, sitting in the serious hunger category. Nearly 1 in 3 Indian children under 5 is stunted. A similar friction exists for a young generation raised on the promise of a demographic dividend. India adds nearly 1 million people to its working-age population every month, but the jobs are not keeping pace. Recent labor market research places the unemployment rate for Indian graduates under 25 at nearly 40%. In May 2026, a massive question paper leak forced the cancellation of NEET, the National Medical Entrance Exam taken by over 2 million students. Weeks prior, the Chief Justice of India had used the word cockroaches in court to describe people obtaining professional credentials fraudulently. Many young Indians heard the insult directed at them. A 30-year-old political strategist turned the phrase into a satirical movement called the Cockroach Janta Party. Within a week, it gained 20 million online followers and moved offline into physical sit-ins across New Delhi and several other major cities, demanding a right-to-employment law. The rapid mobilization of the Cockroach Janta Party proves a massive young population feels disconnected from the nation's economic success. They are confronting a demographic reckoning, and the government's combative dismissals of the protests have only fueled the anger. Meanwhile, the state is rapidly re-engineering its resource economy. In 2025, India hit a major policy milestone years ahead of schedule by blending 20% ethanol into every liter of petrol sold. It cuts the crude oil import bill, curbs emissions, and generated more than 1.58 lakh crore rupees in direct income for farmers. But because India's ethanol comes almost entirely from food crops like sugarcane and maize, expanding production requires diverting land and water. In one recent supply year, the government released more than 5 million tons of public food distribution rice, reserves intended to backstop food security for the poor, to produce fuel instead. For agricultural laborers on the ground, the economic reality remains deeply precarious. National crime data shows an average of 13,600 farmers and farm laborers have died by suicide every year since 1995. Even with a fragile decline over the last 3 years, that is still one farmer ending their life roughly every hour. Marginalized groups face a more direct application of state power. Researchers documented over 1,300 hate speech events targeting religious minorities in 2025 alone. Rights organizations also track the recurring practice of bulldozer justice, the extrajudicial demolition of Muslim-owned homes and businesses by local authorities following communal incidents. Top-down policy achievements, like energy milestones and massive welfare schemes, often run directly parallel to resource trade-offs and structural violence experienced by the country's most vulnerable citizens. One person embodies the collision of environmental policy, education reform, and the state's response to dissent. Sonam Wangchuk is a celebrated educator and the most visible face of Ladakh's demand for inclusion under the 6th Schedule, a constitutional provision that would grant the region's tribal majority population legal control over its own land. Wangchuk relies on nonviolent hunger strikes. In late 2025, after a protest in Leh turned chaotic, the government detained him without trial for 170 days under the National Security Act. Upon his release in mid-2026, he joined the youth protests in New Delhi, immediately launching his 6th indefinite hunger strike. Government officials point out they have established dialogue channels, delivering local concessions like increased tribal reservation quotas and official status for regional languages. Wangchuk and his allies insist those procedural gains are meaningless without the binding constitutional guarantees required to protect a fragile Himalayan ecology. This is the data of a divided democracy. It is a country that runs the largest food subsidy program on Earth while sitting low on the hunger index. It is a Supreme Court that strikes down ruling party policies and a security apparatus that detains educators without trial. The health of a democracy is not secured merely by opening the polls for 642 million voters on Election Day. It is tested in the years between by whether the state answers its starving, protesting citizens with a dialogue or with a crackdown.